Hey, everybody, this is Beth Bond, co-creation care chair of Decatur First United Methodist Church. As you know, we've been doing an ongoing series called People on the Margins, which is all about environmental justice and injustice. I learned that yesterday, Daniel, that we need to really call it injustice because there's still so much injustice happening in this space.
That's true.
I always date my videos, unfortunately, but I want to give perspective. We are doing this video right the day after Juneteenth. Daniel has gratefully taken time away from his family to be with us. And so there's a lot of...
And the day before Father's Day.
And the day before Father's Day, right. You can tell us about the boys in a minute. And so, this is a really hot topic. And initially when sort of the issues came out about the police, we didn't hear a lot about the environmental justice aspect of it. And even though we started our series back in March, it's just so important to have this conversation, especially while people are really trying to learn. So Daniel, thank you, and welcome.
How are you? It's good to hear from you. And people that don't know, we go back. We have a history together, and I thank you, and I hope you and your family is doing very well.
Thank you. Now tell me how old the boys are, because let's just start there, because that's the most important thing you do, right?
I have 3 sons who are growing up faster than I can keep up with. They're 15, going on 16 in August. Another one is 12, going on 13 in, next week, actually, June 28th. And my baby boy, 3 sons. So my baby is 8 years old. He'll be 9 in September. So they're growing up fast. They're keeping me on point. They've been hanging out. You know, the COVID crisis, unfortunately, has forced many of us to shelter in place, but I've enjoyed it. We all have our days, but to be in the house with my boys and to have an opportunity to be more hands-on as a father and bring them to political rallies and to, obviously they have their masks on, but it's been a great journey and we've done a lot together, and I'm super excited. And to all the fathers listening, grandfathers listening, happy Father's Day to everybody out there. I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation and wouldn't want to be anywhere else right now than with you. So I appreciate it.
Great. So let's talk, because a lot of people don't know about environmental justice. Like I said, this is the 5th in a series. We started with these live, and then COVID hit, and so we ended up doing these on Zoom. And the thing I like about Zoom is, it's they have a longer life, right?
Yeah, true.
Energy equity is a huge piece of this environmental justice thing. How would you describe energy equity to people who don't know what that even means?
Well, for people that don't know what it means, I would first give a historical context. Obviously, this being the day after Juneteenth, I believe in energy independence and the opportunity for energy to be, to not be limited to your zip code or to your socioeconomic status. And when we think of equal rights, too often we think about the racial side of it. We don't really think about environmental injustice. We don't really think about the fact that many of the barriers to entry, nor the fact that when the American environmental movement started, it was an affluent and a white movement. It wasn't considerate of Blacks and poor and low-income communities. It wasn't considerate of a lot of different areas. With the advent of us, many of us that believe in a clean energy future and a clean energy economy, when you think of things like solar, access to solar energy should not be based on the amount of money you have in your bank account. So when I think of energy equity, I think of the ability to really allow this to be something that everyone has an opportunity to access, right? Like not just folks who can afford a 10 or 15,000 solar system, but individuals that are impacted the most, which I'll get into later, but 68% of communities of color are in proximity to a coal-fired plant. 20% of communities of color are in proximity to a fossil fuel waste facility. So when you think about environmental injustice, environmental equity, however you want to lay it out, we have to think about making sure that communities, not just Black communities and brown communities, but low and moderate income communities as well, have an opportunity to partake in clean energy, because many of our communities, specifically the Black community, are getting asthma rates 3 times the national average, and our senior citizens 65 years old and up are suffering at 4 times the rate with upper respiratory illness. So those are all issues attributed to clean water, clean air, and the types of energy we use that have an impact on our communities.
Okay, so of course, I know why asthma is an issue, but let's explain to our audience why energy equals asthma.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at emissions and you look at, let's just be honest. Most of your inner cities, your, Los Angeles, Atlanta, right? Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Detroit, Michigan, like a lot of these cities have high populations of Black and brown communities. So air quality is a huge issue. One of the things most people don't realize, especially when we talk about coal-fired plants and fossil fuel, but the types of contaminants that are in the air that we breathe has a tremendous impact. When we think about Atlanta, we like to make a lot of jokes and memes about Atlanta traffic and Los Angeles traffic and DC traffic. But those emissions that go into our atmosphere ultimately have an impact on the air we breathe and our lungs. And realistically, I remember a couple of years ago, our friend Laura Turner Seidel, I remember Laura was talking to me about an initiative that schools in the city of Atlanta had taken where in carpools, cars could not be idle, nor could buses. Well, in a lot of low-income communities, they don't have those same types of standards or rules. So our children are constantly exposed to unbalanced and really unhealthy air quality. And that is one of the key indicators to when you're looking at measuring the areas that are impacted the most as it relates to asthma cases and respiratory. And here's another thing that I'll say to those that are listening. It's not just about the health aspect of asthma. It's about school days that are missed by our children and work days that are missed by the providers in our homes, whether they be parents or guardians. But, when we miss days because of respiratory illness, specifically illnesses like asthma, it tremendously has an impact on our productivity as a whole.
Yeah, and I think for, as you said, we go back a ways, right? I mean, 12 years, which means I'm 22. So, but what we know is not everyone, unfortunately, is sort of compelled from the human aspect of it.
That's right.
If you're compelled by the economics aspect of it, sick workers equals issues for your company, right? Kids missing school, it means, tax dollars aren't being spent the way you want it to be spent because they're missing it because of asthma. So
right.
Look at it from I, of course, choose to look at it from a humanities perspective, but there is a huge economic aspect to this, and it's just inequity, right? It's just inequity, whether you're looking at health, education, quality of life, or just people not being in communities that because they're being oppressed by all the pollution in their communities. So
and I would be remiss if I didn't mention, I just left the Caribbean rally for Black Lives in Atlanta, and the Caribbean community came out just like many other parts of our cities that are really standing in solidarity. But I left the King Center where the march and the talk was being held. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that Dr. King once said that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So when we think of these low-income communities and moderate-income communities, when we think of poor communities, when we think of Black and brown communities in proximity to these areas, we've got to think of it not just as a health disparity, right? Like health disparity is a really cute way of saying injustice, right? And we have to start calling it what it is. It is not morally, ethically, or legally right for people to live or be strategically placed in zip codes that are adversely and overwhelmingly affected by the types of air we generate or by a low or lack of energy standards and policies that protect the health and well-being of people in those communities. We have to change that and address it, and I'm happy we're having this conversation.
Right. So coal-fired plants, in some places, we still have a couple of big ones in Georgia. The ones that were actually burning in Atlanta now have all been shuttered, right?
Yeah, but you still have areas like, Plant Share years ago. I was, down in Macon and some of these other areas. We are seeing a closing down of many of the coal-fired plants that exist. And we're seeing, I think the trend is going in the right direction, but it's not happening fast enough. And here's the thing, even though, because I don't want to get too much into, the plants that are currently here, we can sit here all day and look at maps all over the United States and look and see what is very clear, which is the positioning of them. What I'm more so concerned about is that this has become a problem that has lasted decade after decade after decade after decade. And in my opinion, there's no better time to really look and want to focus in and invest in the infrastructure that will create a clean energy economy, because you're absolutely right. If you just look at where those plants are today, even the ones that were taken offline, when you look at coal ash and the effects that we've seen from some of them that are no longer there, that have contaminated the water, like in Juliet, Georgia, when you're looking at these areas where federal funding is no longer available to test the drinking water, where people like you and I know that lead and mercury and different levels of toxins are in the waters, we have to really start thinking about the effects and the impacts of those communities. We're not measuring them. We're not resourced enough to be able to test the children and the individuals and how that's affecting their education levels, how it's affecting productivity, how it's affecting work. And you know, these are things that I think are branches off of the same tree, which is the injustice that you opened up this conversation with.
Right. So, and I do want to get people a little more up to speed. So, you know, we've been transitioning away from coal, but we've, you know, replaced it with methane. And methane is also an environmental justice. Is it as bad as coal? No, but it's still bad, right? Like, less bad than bad is still bad, right?
Yes, it's like switching your choice of candy, right? Like, I mean, it still doesn't have a overall benefit, and you're absolutely right. And I think what people have to understand is that's what Dr. King talked about for so long, about injustice not just being in a sense of one thing that's affecting us, but the multiple things that we don't even know about. You know, whether it's, you know, I spoke to 200 Black farmers the other day about food security and GMOs, right? I mean, you know, what people don't realize is that energy and environmental justice isn't limited to the utilities that are regulated or the types of energy we provide. If we're not talking about food deserts, if we're not talking about access to clean energy, if we're not talking about all these things in singular conversations, then we're missing the mark. Because what happens is, we just talked about, you know, fossil fuel energy and methane gas and all these different areas. We have to show people that health and wellness is interconnected. And if we're not talking about all the aspects that are leading to health challenges or wellness challenges or even just social activity, then we're missing the mark. And we have children that are becoming obese at alarming rates. We have the asthma rates we just talked about, and we're also having kids, because of COVID-19, that are still not being able to really, you know, develop their wholeness. And I think those are a lot of areas we have to discuss. And it's really time for us to take ownership of them. We've been putting them off for a long time, but they're affecting us at rates that are growing out of control at this point.
Right. Well, and I think that's a good way to sort of shift to the conversation of renewables. So here's the thing about renewables, like, you know, even I can't afford renewables, right? So for those of us who live more modestly, renewable, like popping solar on your roof is just not an option, right? But renewables still have a huge role to play in the transition for just energy. Can you discuss like what renewables look like for a just energy transition?
You know, it's funny. I've been looking at a lot of models. I was very fortunate. A good friend of mine, Matt Peterson, used to run sustainability for Mayor Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles. And, you know, for me, you know, and I hope not to stray too far off the question, but I look at, you know, back to the point about equity and a just energy transition, like what that looks like to me are policies first that are in alignment that bring everybody into the fold, right? Like when you think of, even to your point, you said, you know, you live very modestly, you know, you're not able to afford renewables, you know, but like, let's think about, you know, renters, let's think about homeowners, let's think about barriers to entries, tax credits. We're not doing enough to create the type of economic infrastructure for us to transition into that type of economy. We're not doing it with our technical colleges. We're not talking about it enough within Black churches or any interfaith church. You know, we're not having these conversations. Some of the organizations are doing a better job, right? So I'm not saying that we're not seeing it, but the policy side is not keeping up with the socioeconomic side. We're not educating our children. So the transition that I would like to see is threefold. Number one, I'd like to see a workforce developed, put in place, and educated that can be in alignment with what that transition looks like, so that we're not entering into an economy that we can't staff. Number two, I'd like to see more education for homeowners, for renters, and for, you know, those who desire to have homes or to start families. You know, we need to start educating people, because even when you talk about organizations like the Public Service Commission, most people don't even know what they do, what they exist. People don't know about, what rooftop solar even is. What is community solar? Net metering. Like, these are all things that have challenged so many people. And the third point that I have to make is that we have to simplify the message, right? There are legislators right now that they agree with solar, they believe in solar, but they don't know or have written or supported many policies that will allow us to make this transition, because maybe it's arguably because they haven't been lobbied the right way. Arguably they might not be educated enough to make those decisions. But I would, even add to that, or even make more prominent of an issue, is that we're just not building the right coalitions that's demanding it. It's one thing to advocate for something. It's one thing to say, here's the economy we desire, what we want, what we would like. But when you put a demand on something and you say, look, this just energy transition is about equity. It's about what's right. It's about making sure that families and that children in schools and churches and anyone in our community can have the opportunity to provide better. If we're not making those kinds of arguments, I don't think we're going to see that transition. I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. I'm excited. But I think we need to do more on the coalition side to bring groups like the Urban League, the NAACP, the Sierra Club. We've got to do more collaborative efforts where there's education, information, and here's the key point, activation, right? If we're not activating people during legislative sessions, during Public Service Commission meetings, during Zoom calls where we can share information, educate the community, bringing minority contractors into it, bringing general contractors, we've got to change the narrative and create this new movement around energy equity that I think folks would buy into.
Well, that's really powerful, and I really appreciate those words. So we're talking about politics, one of my favorite topics, and a lot of times the Christian community is a little leery about talking about it. They don't want to make anybody mad. But I keep on saying, hey, Jesus was political.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, Jesus was political. Jesus came in and said, I'm going to create a new way, and that new way included the culture of what was happening in regards to politics, because
that's right.
Preaching to oppressed people, right? I mean, he was preaching to Jews, and they were oppressed that time underneath the Romans. So there's a little biblical history that I slipped in there. I didn't mean to. So
no, I don't apologize for it. I mean, people, but and I don't mean to cut you off, but that's a part of the problem, right? Like, we have to, and I know a lot of people are going to take, they might question the way I'm saying what I'm about to say. We've got to weaponize the pulpit. I mean, plain and simple. We don't do a good enough job of teaching the radical side of our faith, right? We're big on teaching about love and joy and meekness, and all those things are extremely important. Teaching about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and all, like, those stories are critical. But if we're not teaching people how to apply biblical principles in an active way, then what we're doing is what the Bible says is faith without works, right? Like, if we're not aligning ourselves with issues that are impacting the people that we're called to serve, then whether you're a Muslim, you're Jewish, whether you're Hindu, it doesn't matter your faith. All faiths that I have studied, that I've read, that I've looked at, that have a moral compass, have all had been rooted in calls to action, and something that you have to do that measures your faith and that literally validates you saying you believe in what you believe. That's why Gandhi, was so adamant about saying, look, our responsibility as a society is about being able to measure them. He had something called 7 social sins, because Gandhi said, even if you're not a religious leader or a faith leader, you're still responsible for the messaging, for the way we carry it out in our daily lives. So I went on a tangent too. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Well, and I'm just thinking about, like, that there's so many leaders who've been calling this, and it's like we've all been asleep at the wheel, right? We've got Dr. King, we've got Gandhi, we've got Jesus, of course.
Yeah.
And I am not a very good student of other faiths, because I feel like I'm such a bad Christian that I got to keep on studying. But I do agree that they're all called to do good works. They're all called to care for those that are least of these. And so, with all that groundwork laid out now that we know where we got to be, right? If you're a person of faith, we know where we got to be. What are some policies that you think that, like, I don't know. Anyway, policies. So I know you're going to be able to give me some, like, state legislator kind of things, but are there policies that some cities and counties, sort of at a more local level, can put in place to start having a real impact on this conversation?
Of course. And I'm going to start off at one point, and I'm going to go federal, state, and local, right? So
Okay.
the first thing I want to say is I was in Rome when the Pope passed it, had his encyclical on climate change. And I had a chance to meet with his cardinal, and we had this big interfaith convergence with the Pope and with the Vatican, where it was ahead of the Paris Climate Accords. After that period, with Obama being in office, many people, if you don't know about it, Obama had something in place called the Clean Power Plan. So along with this was the United States and other nations that worked very hard to reduce the amount of emissions globally over the next, well, at the time, over the next 5 years, which would have put us right at 2020, 2021. Well, the challenge with what we had seen was that when the administration shifted and the Trump administration came in, their priorities were different. Whether you agree with the Republican Party or you disagree with the Democrat, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is the United States was poised globally to work on making decisions from a policy level and from a governance level that we would take a responsibility on our role as it related to global climate impact, right? So here's what cities did, which is why it's so important. Even though the Trump administration rolled back, a lot of the Obama era policies that would have put us in alignment globally to do our part, we saw cities, not just Democratic cities, but Republican cities. We saw cities, we saw counties, we saw entire states that said, hey, we're going to create our own resilience plan. We're going to create our own, like the city of Atlanta, starting with Mayor Kasim Reed and even into Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, we see a chief sustainability officer, right? We're seeing cities that are saying, hey, we're going to create sustainability and resilience starting with us. We're going to take ownership of it. And that's the first thing I would say from a local standpoint. We need to make sure that mayors, county commissions, city councils, they're establishing within their own purview an opportunity for them to have a direct impact, whether it's a recycling program or it's making rooftop solar affordable. We need to start taking ownership at the local level, which is why electing mayors and city councils that are progressive in a way of thinking about energy for the future. There's a quote that says, we do not, we're well able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own. If we don't have municipalities, cities, and governments in place that are doing things now that don't compromise future generations, then we're missing the mark. Now, on a federal level, this is for whether, Trump gets a second term, which I personally hope he does not, or Joe Biden gets elected. We have to have at the federal level the most comprehensive infrastructure plan the United States has ever seen. I don't just mean about roads and bridges. I mean about our electric grid. We need to have a fundamentally strong and powerful federally funded infrastructure build that protects our grid. I would love to see us transition from nuclear over a period of time in the state of Georgia and other areas, but we've got to protect our nuclear facilities. We've got to make sure Homeland Security can protect our energy grid. We've got to make sure that a part of this federal package is to ensure that states have the capacity to deal with extreme weather. And this all is tied in to packaging that would specifically speak, not just to climate mitigation, but that would speak to preparedness. Because if you look, for instance, and I'll give you a COVID example that, in my opinion, the climate crisis and the COVID crisis, they parallel each other. There's so many parallels between the two. One of them that stands out more than anything, which is a part of preparedness, is our infrastructure as it relates to wireless broadband. When we think of our energy grid, the mantra of the Public Service Commission is to ensure safe and reliable energy through the utilities that they regulate. So safety and reliability is critical. But if you don't have access to the internet, if you don't have access to the types of things that are going to allow us to operate in unison, then these conversations are really meaningless. We've got to have an infrastructure package that really supports the narrative and allows us to move into a more secure future as it relates to energy and the types of energy we want to support, whether it's biofuels or solar or it's wind off the coast of Georgia or any other coast around the United States, right? The second thing we need to do is look at governors that are supporting initiatives around the state that, in my opinion, in the South, we've got to start looking at the agricultural part of our state, because as many of these areas are not becoming sustainable. And what I mean by that is a lot of farmers right now are struggling because they've not been given the tools, the infrastructure, the insight, or the funding to be able to carry on. So what we have to do is look at innovative ways to support farmers and to support landowners excuse me, that can create solar farms that can expand throughout local communities. So I think there's a couple of things we can do, but we've got to focus on how we change that narrative.
So, well, you know, I love solar farms, and I did consulting work with several solar companies, and I always loved planting the idea of, you know, be a solar harvest sunshine, right? The great thing for solar and farmers is that sun's going to shine most days year round, right? You're
That's right.
only grow in the summer. Maybe you get some like weird squash broccoli thing in the winter, but you can harvest sunshine all year round, and you never have to water it, and you
That's
never
right.
have to worry about a drought. So, yeah, I love that as a secondary crop. And so many farmers, you know, they're really, really intelligent people, and they understand so many things about crop rotation and things like that. But you know, they got to get educated on solar, and that's not because it's not their fault they don't know about solar. It's because we're not doing enough to get them educated about solar. And for some place like the Southeast, but in particular South Georgia, where, you know, we're just really, really ripe. And it would be really great for us to be able to export energy as Georgians. You know, and that's totally a doable thing. And considering how much Florida continues to grow, you know, it makes sense to me that we could be exporting a lot of solar into the Panhandle in particular.
Of course.
Revenue, right? A new revenue for Georgia. So,
and let's think about it, right? And I'll say this real quick in closing. It's just like, look at what the film industry did, brought billions of dollars, right, to Georgia's industry. The industry bought billions of dollars to Georgia's economy. And what could we do if we had this plan for rural Georgia, right? Like in these cities where they have literally been economically deprived. You know, what could, you know, like what happened in Dalton, Georgia, with a solar manufacturing facility that totally, you know, spurred that economy. And now they have not just with their jobs, with their economy, but we're creating entire economic engines behind the development and the deployment of solar. And we have to think about that, not just from an economic standpoint as it relates to, you know, financing those projects for the companies to do better, but looking at how do we restore these counties and communities that have been left behind. So I just wanted to add that to your point.
Right. Well, and I think that's a really valid point, because that goes directly back to the injustice of it all, right?
Yeah.
Like as Atlanta grows, great, but we are also leaving many counties behind for the rest of the state. And, you know, they're like, well, we need the economic engine of Atlanta. Yes, we do. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't seek opportunities for the other places in the state. And so,
and the thing that people have to understand is, according to the Atlanta Regional Commission, the Metro Atlanta region is a 22 county region, right? Arguably. And some people say, hey, Fulton, DeKalb, Clayton, whatever, right? Cobb. But when you look at the region, the Metro Atlanta region, assuming those were 22 counties, let's be honest, those 22 counties are doing well. Are there pockets in Fulton and DeKalb that are not doing well? Of course there are. Are there pockets in Forsyth County, where I live, that are not doing well? Of course they are. But for the most part, these areas have amassed a significant amount of wealth. They have access to transit. They have access to multiple food options, including farmers markets. But when you get outside of the perimeter and you start looking at communities like in South Georgia, like in Dougherty County, or I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, in Muskogee County. Outside of Muskogee, you have Harris County. When you look at Lowndes County, when you look at a lot of these areas in Georgia, they have not had a fair chance from an educational standpoint, an economic standpoint, or a social standpoint. And I truly believe that we can begin to drive new investments in clean energy to some of these areas. And look, it's not an answer that's going to solve everybody's problem, but I can guarantee you this: it will put them in a much better position to compete and to be better than where they are currently, how they're currently situated.
right. Well, and this is another lesson from COVID. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of Georgia knowledge. I do actually, ironically, have sort of Mississippi knowledge. So, and this is why creating these engines of economic opportunity outside Metro. And by the way, I remember when it was 6. That's how long I've lived in Atlanta. I remember when it was 6, and now it's 22. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You know, the schooling was like, I am just crushed and destroyed. I have a friend who's she lives in Mobile, but she drives to Mississippi. It's only about 45 minutes away. And schooling for them during COVID just fell apart because they didn't have the access to, they didn't have access to the internet. They didn't have access to computers. I mean, there are places like that in Georgia. Now, I do know from one of my neighbors that DeKalb County was helpful in sending computers down to kids down in the south part of the state, but you still got to have broadband. Can't do it without.
That's right.
And so, and this once again plays into the equity piece. Like, if you're going to have equity, whether it's energy equity or economic equity, you have got to have equity in the education system.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Right, and that's why broadband is such an important part of the equity conversation, because there's just whole parts of Georgia that there's still on. I don't know if it's dial up, but it might as well be dial up, right?
Yeah, it's multiple. Some of it's dial up. Some people, look, I'm hearing stories in areas around the state where kids are having to drive to parking lots with Chick-fil-A, McDonald's, or Burger King and sit in that parking lot for hours at a time just to have access to the internet. So, you have some areas where, you've got dial up. I have to, even though I don't agree with many of the governor's, policies that he's made over the last, how he's navigated us through COVID, but AT&T and the governor's office deployed 500 mobile hotspots. Now that's great. It's not enough, but the fact that they did it is very helpful, because too often these kids are in areas that, are just deprived, right? They're economically and infrastructure wise, they're deprived. And I had a chance to work during the Obama administration under 3 White House initiatives, which I was very privileged to work on. One of them was with Michelle Obama. It was the Let's Move campaign. And we talked about food deserts. And the big conversation was lack of access to healthy food and schools not having farm to table. These were really, adequate and legitimate arguments. But as I traveled around Georgia, which has 159 counties, we started to realize it's not just food deserts, it's information deserts. It's literally 2 and 3 counties at a time that do not have access to high-speed internet. Now, that's not just a problem for K through 12 education. Look at all the kids that have stayed home because of COVID, that have had to work from home, right? Like that is going to be a tremendous blow. I guarantee you, come August and September, we're going to be in another crisis, which is an education crisis, because we just lost 6 months. Really, if you count from March to September, we're going to be at around 6 or 7 months to ultimately where kids are going to have to catch up, because online learning has fundamentally changed. And a lot of us aren't equipped. I like the Florida model. The Florida model is in place for preparedness because many of those school districts are in hurricane zones. So a lot of them have, for the last decade, had online learning and systems set up for success, including access to wireless broadband. In Georgia, we haven't been proactive. We haven't been proactive for a long time, and we need to start considering pockets that I am deeming information deserts, because throughout Georgia, in too many places, especially in the rural parts of our state, in the mountainous parts of our state, in the coastal parts of our state, we're seeing areas that are just lacking access to technology. And we all know that if you can't get information, if you can't keep up with your news, if you can't get access to online learning, if our small businesses can't get online to do online transactions, our economies are not going to be able to grow. They're going to be stagnant, and ultimately they're going to collapse.
Well, that is really valuable insight, and I thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm going to totally quote you all the time now about information deserts. That's my new thing. Daniel Blackman said information deserts. He's so right. Hashtag so right. So that's really
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. But it's like we don't even think about it, and that just all goes back to this equity piece. Is like, Black Lives Matter. We're really focused on police departments, but the reality of it is it's so much bigger than just police departments. And I'm not saying we should make the changes that we're making, right? But we got to think bigger, right?
We have to, and I've been teaching so amazing you said that I'm the father of 3 Black boys. I've been teaching them all the last couple of months. Don't get caught up in the police brutality narrative if you're not going to be caught up in the entirety you know, whether it's institutional racism, structural racism, able to attain loans and opportunities. You've got Black businesses right now in the United States that are fully operational, profitable, respectful organizations. And they cannot even qualify with perfect credit for business loans that will help them expand from a small business to a mid-sized business right now in the United States. That's an equity issue. You have students right now that are living in areas where the public schools are not funded as much on the south side as they are on the north side. Case in point, if you look at it, Atlanta is leading in the United States. This is not Daniel Blackman saying this. This is data that has been sent out from the Department of Commerce and many other civic organizations around the country. The income inequality gap in the city of Atlanta is larger than any other city. And that speaks volumes because, you know, let's be honest, there are not that many cities in the United States that have as much successful and wealthy Black families as the city of Atlanta. You know, and that's not, I mean, you can look at Baltimore, you can look at, you know, Detroit, you can look at a lot of areas. But when we start looking at median income in a lot of communities of color, Atlanta is actually in a position where our numbers are a little higher. However, a kid in Atlanta that is born into poverty has a 92% chance of remaining in poverty. Let me say that again. If you are born into poverty in Atlanta, you have a 92% chance of remaining in poverty. Those are numbers that came from Atlanta public schools. So when we're thinking about equity, you can't talk about equity without talking about access. And that's a lot of what our policy has to be about. We have to start making policies that are not attributed solely to individuals that live in the right zip code or are in the right tax bracket. If it doesn't make sense for everyone, it shouldn't make sense for anyone.
Well, and that's really important. And that has got me thinking about like the equity of, you know, paying taxes. And so, you know, we have to, like, schools are perfect for solar if their roof is good, because it's just a flat roof. And it's going to sit there and generate electricity, you know, just like that farmer, he's going to have that crop for 12 months. That solar is going to produce for 12 months.
That's right.
You know, even when it's empty, which is great. And so we need to be thinking about, like, how do we spend our tax dollars the wisest? Is the wisest thing to do is pay tax dollars so they can turn around and spend more money with companies that are publicly traded and the stockholders are happy? Or is it wiser to take those tax dollars, generate our own electricity, reduce our bills in that respect so we can invest what's most important, which is our kids, right? Like,
well, the problem is we keep making decisions and increasing taxes without measurable outcomes. And let's just be honest. Most Americans don't have a problem if you increase taxes and we can measure the impact it had on what our taxes was increased for. But when we're constantly being berated with increased utility bills, more expensive items, more expensive gas, you know, after a while, that burden becomes too much to bear. So I think, to your point, one, let me start with the schools. I agree with you. Most schools and most churches, most individual families by itself don't get what's called an itemized bill, okay? If you look at what the average utility ratepayer in the state of Georgia has paid, that has Georgia Power, they have paid in excess of about $1,000 to about $1,200 over the past decade, okay? In the last decade, if you get an itemized bill, you look on your bill and you have something called Nuclear Construction Cost Recovery, NCCR, okay? That money goes to the construction of nuclear plant Vogtle reactors 3 and 4, okay? Well, when you look at schools and churches, they have not paid $100 extra per month. They've paid almost $1,000 extra. And this now, it puts them in a much separate space, right? Because if you look on NCCR, on average, you're paying about $10 a month, $100 a year over a 10-year period. That's $1,000. Well, if you're paying about $1,000 as a church in a year instead of that 100 that most people are, you put yourself in a much harder position. What could we do if the $10,000 or $12,000 that the schools have paid into this went into solar infrastructure? To your point, what if we said, you know what, we're going to give a tax credit and rebate right now for schools to build the capacity right now in Dalton and Muskogee and Raymond and Forsyth and Hall and Fulton? What if we just totally structured our schools and positioned our schools to generate their own power? that could create opportunities for public utility, for community solar, but there are barriers to entry. And until we can educate at the local level, our school boards and our county commissions, specifically county commissions that work on zoning, if we're not talking to these individuals and bringing them at the table with leaders and with scientists and with individuals that have the best interest of the community, we're going to be constantly facing these situations where we're leaving money on the table and health is not getting better, it's getting worse, and we can prevent those issues.
Right. Well, and yeah, so that's I didn't even think about, when we were thinking about local policy, I always forget about the school board, which is terrible. Because, I mean, you know, I don't know about other places in the country, but in Georgia, most of your property tax actually goes to schools, right? 2/3
Right.
tax
You're right.
to school. And so, you know, yeah, it's, and look, you know, I know people, I think one of the biggest challenges with Americans is we always think about federal level, but I beg people, please work on the local. You have so much more influence on the local.
Agreed.
I'm very active in local politics, but never ask me who I'm voting for, because I will pick the loser every single time. So, but you know, I've been on, I don't even know if you know this, I've been on community council, which is the first step of the planning process in DeKalb County, for over 15 years now. And
wow.
I have to tell you, it's not my favorite thing that I do, but I feel like we've had some positive influence.
Good.
Right?
And I tell people all the time, to your point about thinking locally, you know, one of the best analogies I can give, because I'm a sports fan and I love baseball, I love football and basketball, but this baseball example, most folks, if you're a fan, you'll get, right? So in baseball, when you hit the ball, you either hit a single, a double, a triple, or a home run, right?
Right.
And the thing about it is, we focus so much politically on home runs. What's a home run? Voting for president and governor, right? Those are home runs. We want our gubernatorial candidate to win. We want our presidential pick to win. When I think of politics on a local level, I think of singles and doubles. We just want to get on base. Right now, we need low, underserved communities to just have a level playing field. And that comes from winning a small battle on the school board. It comes from a small battle in zoning. You don't need more than 1 or 2 people in each of these spaces to begin to change the trend and shift the mindset. But if you're not willing to do these parts, again, those singles and doubles, just getting on base, getting people positioned to implement the right policies, then I think we're losing a lot. And what I'd like to point to even what Tacoma, Maryland did. In Tacoma Park, Maryland, they lowered the voting age to 16 years old. And as a result, they're now getting a lot of ideas coming from a lot of the school board driven ideas and county commission driven ideas are now becoming more progressive, not because more Democrats or liberals are moving into an area, but because the young people are saying, hey, I want better lunch. Hey, I want clean air. Hey, I'd like to have solar on my school. Hey, I'd like to, you see what I'm saying? When we bring new audiences into the fold that are living these things every day, we put ourselves in a position to accelerate change.
Wow, that's awesome, Daniel. That is really, really awesome. So I think we've had a great conversation about equity. I know you've got to get to something else. So I want to wrap this up with, name 3 things the average rank and file American voter, person of faith, can do to just change their corner of the world.
Wow, that's the first time I've been asked not a question of a call to action, but it positioned like that. I think the first thing I would do is, and this is going to sound super simplistic, but I would first start at my own dinner table. I don't think Americans do a good enough job of having conversations within their own homes. You know, with my family, every time a ballot comes up or there's a protest or there's a challenge, we talk about it. My kids will tell you right now, if they were in here, you know, sometimes it bores the hell out of them. You know, they sit back and they're like, oh man, we have to talk about another amendment or whatever, right? Because I'm that dad that will bring up, you know, an issue. But, you know, my kids to this day will tell you, hey, you know, I talked to my friends and they didn't know this or they didn't know that. So we've got to make conversations that happen at our dinner tables contagious. That goes for our churches. If your church limits information to the four walls of the church, you're missing the mark. We've got to start taking more responsibility, and the leadership comes from out of our places of faith and worship. And what I mean by that is, in Forsyth County right now, when the Black Lives Matter conversations really began to heat up, for those of you that don't know about Forsyth County, Georgia, the 22nd example is in 1912, Black folks were forcibly removed. In 1987, there was one of the biggest race marches in the history of the South. And fast forward to where we are in 2020, we now live in a county that has the fastest growing Indian population in the United States and one of the fastest growing Latino and Black populations in this part of North Georgia. That being said, I recently met with pastors from many of the local churches, with Republican elected officials. I happen to be a Democrat, but we met with the elected Republican state senator, and we met with the sheriff. And what we did was we all came together and we said, how do we change this in the positions we're in? So that's the second part. The first part is our dinner tables. The next part is coalition building in our communities. You may just be a member of your church, but if you go to your minister, your deacon, your pastor, the elder of your church, and you say, hey, you know what, this Black Lives Matter thing is really starting to, be brought up in my house. My kids see it on TV. They see it on the internet. Can we have a conversation about this, right? Encouraging your civic leaders, your faith leaders, and your school systems to do that. And in Forsyth County this year, one of the things that we're going to push is to try and have some form of Juneteenth taught within the school system during Black History Month. This is an obstacle within itself, but it's something that we can begin to do to change the narrative of education in our communities. And then lastly, if you're not registered to vote, and you are out there or you're listening, I would really plead with you to register to vote. If you're registered to vote but you're inactive, I would plead with you to become active. We cannot live in a society where we're constantly seeing things change in real time. Not just a man losing his life because of a police officer putting the weight of his body on his neck, not just in communities where we're seeing low-income families that are struggling, not in a society where we're simply seeing the attack on women, whether it's at wage equality or it's sexual harassment. We've got to start looking at the totality of our society. And we've got to really ask ourselves a personal question. What am I doing when no one else is watching? Who am I when it's just me, myself, and God, right? Who is it when it's just me and my children? Whatever your faith is, whatever your belief is, whatever your situation is, when it's just you and those who know you more than anyone else, what decisions are you making? What changes are you making? What are you implementing in your life? And what are you doing in your communities? If we can do those three things, organize in our homes at our tables, organize our civic organizations in our churches, and then get our own lives in order, our own houses in order, our own decisions. Here's the part that I'll leave you with. Frederick Douglass has a quote that said, it's better to build strong children than to repair broken men. If we're not willing to repair our communities and build our communities, let me rephrase that. If we're not willing to build the kind of households and communities that we want, we're going to end up repairing them in the future because we didn't lay the foundation early to allow the next generation to make better choices. So I hope that helps, and I hope that answers your question. And I'm so privileged to be able to have this conversation with you.
Well, this has really been powerful, and I think that's the one thing that churches can do really well, which is build great children. So I am United Methodist, but I tell people I'm so bad I go to church twice on Sundays, and I'm a big fan of Andy and the North Point gang. And one of the things that Andy always says, and this just resonates with me, he goes, we want to plant Jesus. We want to anchor Jesus in your child's heart so much that when it's time to stray, they don't stray far, right? And so I think that is the call of every single church. I think that's the call of every single church member, regardless of what denomination or faith you're in, is build those citizens. So thank you for bringing those words of wisdom, because that's really, really powerful. So
thank you.
Well, okay, we're going to wrap up. I want to thank you so much because we did this sort of quickly. And I will look forward to seeing you in the community. And we've got our call to action, and it's all thanks to you. So
thank you.
See you in the future. Thanks, Daniel.
I'll be here. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.